Hey everybody, Dr. Phil here. This is going to be a fairly brief video on economic growth. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. So let's talk very briefly about the nature of growth. So economic growth refers to increases in the output of goods and services. So there are really two different ways in which we can increase that output if we choose to do that. We can make either short-run capacity changes, or of course we can make long-run capacity changes. Now, obviously, think about the time period here and the time frame. Both have different implications for our economic welfare as a nation and also globally. So, one kind of growth comes from increased use of our production capability. So, think about all the things that all the goods and services that we theoretically could produce. So, by using all of these resources and the best expertise, we can produce any combination of goods on what we call the PPC, the production possibilities curve. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The economy often produces a mix of output that lies inside our production possibilities. So the short-run goal of macro policy is to achieve full employment, i.e., to move us to a point on that production possibilities curve. So we kind of want to be on the curve more so than we want to be inside the curve, because then that would speak to inefficiencies, etc. So long-run changes in capacity. So once we're fully utilizing our productive capacity, further increases in output are attainable only if we expand that capacity. We basically got to find a way to push that curve out, right? So such shifts can imply an increase in potential GDP, gross domestic product. That, of course, is our productive capacity. Now, if we want to achieve large and lasting increases in output, we've got to find a way to push, like I said, we've got to kind of push our PPC, our production possibilities curve out to the right. Economists often define economic growth in terms of changes in potential GDP. Now, there's different ways you could measure economic growth, but most economists around the world would say that GDP is probably the foremost metric. So we can see here the two types of growth. We've got short run on the left, we got long run on the right. So plotted on the y-axis is investment goods, plotted on the x is consumption goods. So you can kind of see, if you think about A as sort of being where we are, B is where we want to be in the short term. But then if you think about in the long run, sort of B again, B is where we want to get to now, but we really want to kind of push that out to the right hand side. So we basically want to increase that. So if we do that, we can increase GDP. Now let's talk a little bit about GDP, nominal versus real. Okay, so nominal GDP is the total value of goods and services produced within a nation's borders, and that's going to be measured in current prices. So increases in nominal GDP could result from either increases in the price level or possibly the quantity, or actually it could be both, right? Think about P times Q, price times quantity is revenue. Nominal GDP can rise even when the quantity of goods and services falls. Okay, so real GDP refers to the inflation-adjusted value of GDP. Real GDP refers to the actual quantity of the output produced, and we refer to real GDP, not nominal GDP, in our concept of economic growth. Because obviously, as we move sort of through the passage of time, through this continuum of time, obviously we have to think about real because we have to adjust for inflation. The GDP growth rate. So changes in real GDP are expressed in percent terms as a growth rate. So the growth rate is the percent change in real GDP from one period to the next. So we just use that formula. Growth rate is just simply change in real GDP on the numerator divided by base period GDP on the denominator. Now the challenge for the future is to maintain higher rates of economic growth. So GDP per capita, when we say per capita, that may be a term you're familiar with, maybe it's not. It just means per individual, basically. So GDP per capita is total GDP divided by total population. So for example, in 2020, the total output in the US was 21 trillion. The population was 330 million. So you can see, just plugged in my numbers, right? 21 trillion of output on the numerator, on the top line, 330 million people on the denominator or the bottom line. So GDP per capita in 2020 was just over 63,000. So this basically indicates how much output was potentially available to the average person. So US GDP per capita interestingly more than doubled since 1980. So the average person nowadays, think about this, has twice as many goods and services as the average person had only a generation ago. So it kind of speaks to how much the economy has grown. Now, most non-Western countries actually have declining GDP per capita due to slow GDP growth and fast population growth. So we can see here, just very quickly, I just wanted to show you this, the history of world growth. So you can see sort of the Western world, right? The West Europe, North America, Japan, and then sort of pretty much everywhere else, right? So you can kind of see as you work your way across, you can kind of see how, like, if you look at like the West, right? 1820, 1,149, 1995. Look at that, 19. So jumped about 19 times. But then if you look down here at say China, you can see China's increase as well, but nothing like the increases that you're seeing in the top here. All right, let's talk quickly about the rule of 72. So small differences in annual growth rates accumulate into large differences in GDP. So the rule of 72 just simply says take 72 divided by the growth rate is going to equal the number of years it takes to double GDP. So again, like 144, right? If you take the 72 divided by 144, you get the 0.5. If you take 72 into 1, of course, is the 1, so on and so forth. So it's just kind of like a hard and fast rule which you can use to figure out how many years will it take to double GDP. All right, so GDP per worker. So the labor force refers to all persons over age 16 who are either working for pay or actively seeking paid employment. One reason our living standard rose in the 90s is that the labor force grew faster than the population. The employment rate is the proportion of adults that are employed. And the employment rate rose from under 60% in 1980 to over 63% in 2007. Now, increases in GDP per capita that have been able to be sustained are more likely to come from increases in output per worker. What I mean by that is like more so than the number of workers increasing necessarily. The total quantity of output produced depends on how many workers are employed and how productive each worker is, obviously. So if productivity is increasing, then GDP per capita is likely going to rise as well. So productivity refers to the output per unit of input. So think about like the output per labor hour, for example. And productivity gains have been the major source of economic growth. So really what's kind of helped in the Western world, obviously the labor force has grown, but also we've been able to be much more productive with the labor we have. So the sources of productivity gains include higher skills, an increase in labor skills, more capital, an increase in the ratio of capital to labor, improved management, better use of available resources in the production process, and technological advancements. The development and use of better capital equipment. Certainly that's been a big thing since the Industrial Revolution. So workers obviously need tools, they need computers, other equipment to produce most of the goods and services. Capital investment is a prime determinant of both productivity and growth. So when we say this term like capital investment, you might be like, what does that mean? Just think about investing in, machines, buildings, typically more expensive things that are going to last, over like multi years. So multi-year investments, you could say. More investment gives the average worker more and better tools to work with. In the 90s, capital investment accelerated. Investments in computer networks and telecommunications surged by 10 to 12% a year. So it's pretty substantial growth, 20%. And productivity gains accelerated into the 2.5 to 2.7% range. So as far as management goes, resources must be organized into a production process and managed. Entrepreneurship and the quality of continuing management are major determinants of economic growth. Managers must also learn to motivate employees to help them achieve their maximum potential. And managers must develop personnel structures and incentives that make employees want to contribute to production. So kind of what that also speaks to is sort of, if you want to go to like the academic management literature and the empirical literature surrounding that is sort of making sure that the incentives for the workers align with the incentives for the firm. So like everybody wins, if you will. Okay, research and development, commonly abbreviated R&D. So R&D could include scientific research, product development, innovations in production techniques, the development of management improvements. These are just, obviously that's not an exhaustive list, these are just some of the things. R&D generally leads to new products and cheaper ways of producing them, and of course that takes time. Advances in technology and capital investments will typically go together, tandem, go hand in hand. So what policy levers, what can the government do to have an impact on this stuff? So government policies can have a major impact on whether and how far the aggregate supply curve shifts. So we could look at policies on education and training, immigration. We're gonna look at all of these briefly. Investment incentives, savings incentives, government finances, deregulation, and of course economic freedom. So let's start with education and training. So the quality of labor largely depends on education and training. Government policies that support education and training contribute directly to growth and productivity, which makes sense. Money spent on schools and training has a dual payoff. Two things. One, it stimulates the economy in the short run. And two, it increases the long run capacity to produce. So we get positive aggregate demand and aggregate supply shifts. One thing I'll just sort of interject real quickly here too is that the developed nations, the US, the UK, Canada, a lot of the Commonwealth countries have really done well here because they've had good educational systems. India too, that have really helped them to improve their worker knowledge and productivity. As far as immigration goes, close to 1 million people immigrate to the United States each year. This influx of immigrants has been a major source of growth in the US labor force. And of course, immigration policy affects the quality and the quantity of labor. Investment incentives. Government policy also affects the supply of capital. Lower tax rates encourage people to invest more. Tax policy is not only a staple of short-term stabilization policy, but also a determinant of long-run growth as well. So, what's happening with tax rates, not just now, but, what people think will happen in the future, will of course depend on, what they spend, what they save, how they save it with respect to tax deferred, so on and so forth. Savings incentives. So supply side economists favor tax incentives that encourage saving and investment. So in the early 80s, Congress greatly increased the incentives for saving. Banks were allowed to increase the rate of interest paid on various types of savings accounts. The tax on earned interest was reduced, and new forms of tax-free savings were created. So things like IRAs, an IRA is an individual retirement account. You may have also heard of a Roth IRA. There's, 403bs, 401ks. The list is pretty much endless. Now, despite these incentives, American households save very little. The US is heavily dependent on foreign saving deposited in US banks and bonds to finance investment and growth. So when the government borrows money to finance its spending, it dips into the nation's savings pool. The government ends up borrowing funds that could have been used to finance investments. The reduction in private sector borrowing and spending caused by increased government borrowing is called crowding. So the term we use is crowding out. So crowding out obviously directly limits private investments. Fiscal and monetary policies must be evaluated in terms of their impact, not only on short-run aggregate demand, but also on long-run aggregate supply. So deregulation. So think about regulation. Government passes regulations to, protect certain things, for example. But it also may deregulate to try to encourage more of a, free-hand market, if you will. So deregulation. The government intervenes directly in supply decisions by regulating employment and output behavior. These regulations are intended to foster safety, security, competition, and environmental protection, just to name some examples. Such regulations limit the flexibility of producers to respond to changes in demand. And government regulation also tends to raise production costs because the government may require you to do more, for example. Deregulation would, of course, shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Next thing we'll talk about is factor markets. So think about like the factors of production. That's kind of what they're meaning here when they say factor markets. So regulation of factor markets include minimum wage laws, OSHA standards. The goal of the minimum wage law is to ensure workers a decent standard of living. Workplace safety and health standards are intended to improve the welfare of workers, obviously, as again, that's part of OSHA. And these regulations also raise the costs of production and inhibit supply responses. Now, just very quickly, I'll just interject, just very quickly, I promise, regarding minimum wage. Minimum wage is a good thing, obviously, but you got to be careful because if with these states that have really increased minimum wages, what you're doing is you're adding in inflationary pressure into the economy. You're making things more expensive. Those costs are then passed on to consumers. So it doesn't, yes, it maybe benefit those people directly, but the wider economy, it may not actually help the wider economy. So just food for thought. All right, product markets. The government's regulation of product markets also raises production costs and inhibits supply. So some examples include transportation costs, food and drug standards, and of course, financial markets. Transportation costs. So at the federal level, various agencies regulate the output and prices of transportation services. So some examples, the CAB, Civil Aeronautics Board, the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, and the FMC, the Federal Maritime just means sea, Federal Maritime Commission. The regulations constrain the ability of producers to respond to increases in demand. The easing of these restrictive regulations have spurred more output, lower prices, and innovation. And of course, again, in the process, the AS, which is aggregate supply curve, is shifted to the right. So again, just think about, governments may regulate, which may constrain production and also supply, and then they may deregulate, which of course should have the opposite effect. Food and drug standards. So the Food and Drug Administration, I'm sure you've all heard of the FDA, has a broad mandate to protect consumers from dangerous products. So the FDA sets health standards for the content of specific foods. The FDA also sets standards for the testing of new drugs and evaluates the results. The FDA standards also entail real costs, and the aggregate supply of goods is shifted to the left again because if they're legislating and saying no, you can't produce this, this is dangerous, then of course that's going to lower the supply, which is going to push that aggregate supply curve to the left. And financial markets. So the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, kind of the housing crash, if you will, prompted a huge increase in federal regulation of financial markets. Congress in 2010 approved the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. The act gave new powers for federal regulators of banks, credit card companies, and other financial institutions. The uncertainties associated with the act made banks less willing to make new loans. So kind of had a bad effect in that sense. In 2018, Congress voted to roll back most of the regulations for smaller lenders and community banks. And the goal was to encourage more mortgage and small business lending. Pretty much, I think the last thing I'm going to talk about is deregulation. I've kind of touched on this briefly earlier in the lecture. Many regulatory activities are, of course, beneficial. Safer food, safer drugs, for example. As a result of such regulation, we get safer drugs, as I just said, cleaner air, less deceptive advertising, and more secure loans. We must also consider the costs involved, however. The basic contention of supply-side economists is that regulatory costs are too high. So to improve our economic performance, we must deregulate the production process, thereby shifting the aggregate supply curve to the right again. But we should at least consider potential trade-offs between increased regulation and increased growth. Think about what I said earlier. The more you regulate, the more you sort of stifle the sort of supply side, if you will. And if you can deregulate, I'm not saying deregulation is always a good thing, then you can probably increase supply. So economic freedom. Governments also establish and enforce rights such as property rights, legal rights, and political rights. The nations with the most economic freedom not only have the highest GDP per capita, but continue to grow the fastest. So these would be countries like the US and the UK, for example. An economy's institutional framework, particularly the extent of market freedom, plays a critical role in its growth potential, kind of alluding to the earlier point that we just said. We have to ask whether any specific government intervention promotes economic growth or slows it, and that could go either way depending on what that specific intervention entails. All right, I said I'd try to be brief. I've tried to be brief. So some things we covered in this video. We specified how economic growth is measured. We described what GDP per capita and GDP per worker measure. We illustrated how productivity increases. We explained how government policy affects growth. And we discussed why economic growth is desirable. Okay, thanks for watching, and I will see you in a future video.